Hi everyone. In this podcast style episode, my sister Bea and I discuss the Uranus archetype via its mythological and astrological meanings. And if you want to hear what next follows, which will be the Neptune archetype, you can already find it at our podcast site via the web link or through any podcast app on your phone. You can find all of these links in the description of this post. Enjoy the Uranus episode.
Welcome to Archetypes and the Planets, where Andre Carr and I, Bea Gonzalez, invite you to think metaphorically as we explore how we have collectively translated the map of the sky into our mythologies, religious systems, and personal psychology. Okay, Andre, so we have reached the truly archetypal point in our journey with the planets. My argument in that is that up to now we've been looking at the traditional 7 planets, the planets and lights from the sun straight out to Saturn, but now we have started the planets that didn't come into visibility until, in the case of the one we're speaking today, until 1781. And that's, of course, Uranus. And I think when you look at archetypal material, which is what I'm really interested in, the archetypal is really what is invisible. It's what's working underneath the surface. And it often causes a lot of drama, a lot of dislocation, precisely because we can't apprehend it through the conscious mind, right? So I think that if you look at these, first of all, I think part of what I'd like to believe is that we are evolving on a human level in a way that we can only apprehend a concept, an archetype, a planet, see it, make it real until we're ready for it. Like, in other words, we can't do it until we're ready for it, I should say. And so it seems to me that maybe there's an argument to be made that we couldn't see Uranus, even though it was always there, until 1781, because we were not at that point that we could develop an understanding of what it could mean. So the way that astrologers have traditionally ascribed meaning to a new planet, because of course you don't have a record of having observed it and the way it behaves, is by looking at what was going on at that point in history. And of course, you and I both know that 1781, the late 18th century, is tremendously radical for what happened, right? So very quickly, you have the Industrial Revolution, proto-industrialization really begins about 1750, so you're in the thick of the Industrial Revolution. You have the American Revolution that basically redefines democracy. And you have the French Revolution, which is really the most radical of all the things that go on. Now, it's interesting. We should point out that during the time of the French Revolution, which began in 1789, it didn't really effectively end until the late 18th century, maybe 1798, 1799, when Napoleon came to power. Pluto was also in Aquarius, so I think we have to remember that. So there was a double whammy going on. Just like right now, Pluto has gone into Aquarius. There is a lot about Aquarius that is really radical, which is one of the reasons I think the modern astrologers ascribe rulership of Aquarius to Uranus, because there is such a radical planet. It doesn't even behave like other normal planets. And you can talk about that in a minute, because I think that's a really interesting synchronicity. Storytelling, of course, but it is an interesting connection. But anyway, it should be remembered that the moment that that planet became visible to mankind with Herschel's sighting of it in 1781, William Herschel, I should put in a plug for his sister, Carolyn, who had a lot to do with that sighting, but who's never really honored the way he is. I won't make any more comments, but just saying. Anyway, it's interesting that this planet came into our view, into consciousness at that point, at a time when there was a lot of radical change. And that I think that maybe this tells us something about how this planet behaves. So what do you make of all this?
Yeah, well, it's exactly what you said, that it's discovered in concurrence with a lot of social revolution, liberation, which is one of the Uranian keywords, type events, breaking free from the shackles. And I think with Uranus, one of the things that is absolutely true is that it rules the incoming technological revolution that humanity tapped into, because it rules electricity. And electricity is where we are today, where we were not pre-Uranus. You know, people had their kerosene lamps and so forth, and now if you say to someone, you lose power, you can't turn on your lights, it's like we totally take it for granted how much that liberates people's lives, how much that makes it possible to do other things and not be, for instance, worried all the time about your food going bad because you have your fridge. And so it's all electricity, right? So Uranus is discovered around that time. The Industrial Revolution starts, and correct in what you say around Aquarius. And I had a really quite a hard time for years accepting that, because I kept thinking Uranus is such a independent energy. It has this quality of self, awareness, driven energy. I thought Aquarius feels like a group energy. But as time passed, first of all, because I could see that the parts of my chart with Aquarius kept getting mysteriously triggered on Uranus transit, so I thought, okay, that must be why. But secondly, in a way, it makes a lot of sense, because Aquarius and Uranus, I think, what they're connecting to is the notion of humanity, but the notion of the individual having a strong place within that group. And if you think about it, that is what democracy is. And notice that democracies seem to take off post that point as well, because I don't know if you knew this, but one of the, I forget which collaboration I did with someone, and I brought up something that seemed to offend a number of people. They said, how can you say that, how did they put it? How can you say that democracies started, that they're connected to, current day, U.S., Europe, etc. Oh no, it was invented by the Iroquois, and it's not. You can't give them credit. Well, that's not what I was trying to say. What I was trying to say is that, it doesn't matter who invented democracy. I'm sure they were doing democratic societies in the Antarctic in the year 1000 or whatever. That's not the point. The point is that when does it become a worldwide phenomenon where more people are living in groups, where, in that sense, you'd say if you have a country like the US with 350 million, the fact that it can continue to be a democracy is almost a miracle, because the idea that everyone can participate is, it's a little challenging, right? So anyway, bottom line, Uranus, Aquarius, technology, democracy. Why? Because the Uranian energy is both extremely independent, but is also linked to the idea of the group, which is the Aquarian idea of groups have the power, not just a single individual, which is, in a way, what we're living through today. That's the struggle at the moment, and that part of the world believes there should be a top-down style, and part of the world continues to believe in the democratic approach to things.
On the point of democracy, you could also argue the ancient Greeks, and this experiment was begun before. But we should just always clarify, yes, but the slaves weren't allowed to be part of that. Women weren't allowed to be part of that. And of course, at the beginning of their democratic revolution in the late 18th century, that was also the case. I think it goes beyond those structures, though. It goes to philosophy. The philosophical foundations of what you see here were written at that point, the late 19th century, including, by the way, on the rights of women, because Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her big treatise on the rights of women in the late 18th century. This century. So this is not just about a structure that we erect, because there have been many structures erected. It's that the philosophical underpinnings of this worldview really began then. So that's something to make. The other point to make, I think, is that we've talked all along this series about how every sign has its polar opposite brought in to the conversation as soon as we talk about it. Well, Leo is the opposite sign to Aquarius, right? If you're going to associate Uranus with Aquarius. And let me be very clear that the Hellenistic astrologers, because they did not have access to this, would not associate it. And I still would traditionally argue that Saturn is the first ruler of Aquarius, but there is definitely a resonance between Uranus and Aquarius for me anyway. Anyway, but the point is the polar opposite is Leo. No, I have a theory thinking about this. If you notice, the Industrial Revolution happened really during the period of Pluto going through Aquarius and incorporated that. Okay, do you notice that at the end we ended up with a Leo character, Napoleon? He is like the ultimate in kingship, right? He is not a king in the usual sense, but he makes himself a king, and he's a great Leo figure in that regard, right? So, in fact, the polarity was enacted within that. You go through this incredible radical period in France, which you ended up with a guillotine, and each subsequent group getting more and more radical and more crazy. They were reinventing the calendar, which is kind of like an Aquarian thing. We're going to start now. 7 Thermidor. They excuse me, they went into the Cathedral of Notre Dame and erected a statue to the goddess Reason being another thing. So it was extreme. But in the end, it kind of brought in its polar opposite, which is kind of an interesting thing to consider about these outer planets. As they go through a sign, does it mean that as you're going through it, that it does necessarily have to bring the opposite sign into the conversation throughout, and maybe even spectacularly near the end? It certainly did at that point. Anyway, going back to Aquarius, we look at it mythologically, the story. Now, here's where Richard Tarnas comes in. Traditionally, the reason Uranus was called Uranus was, by the way, for those who don't know, I always really laugh because the original name proposed for this planet was first Herschel, to name it after William Herschel. That was knocked down. Then it was George. Do you imagine going from Saturn to George in honor of King George III? It's like, no, that's not going to work. And then eventually, they had to establish some sort of, and so they thought, well, Saturn was the father of Jupiter. And so Uranus is the father of Saturn. So let's make him the guy. And then Richard Tarnas comes along and says, Richard Tarnas, being the author of Cosmos and Psyche and quite well respected about these archetypal stories, he said, this is wrong. This is the only misnamed planet, which again, I think sounds very Uranian to me. What a Uranian story. You get the name wrong only on this one planet, right? Because it's so eccentric and it behaves kind of weirdly to begin with. And he proposes that the real name for this planet should be Prometheus. Now, I'm going to argue for both. I'm going to say that Uranus, we have very little information about him in the myth, but I will tell you that we have just one story, and that is that he is castrated, right, by his son Saturn, Kronos, and his testicles fall into the sea, and out of the foam springs Venus Aphrodite. And I think this is a very small story, but it's very impactful. First of all, anybody who's ever been through an Uranian transit will tell you that it feels like you've been shocked. It's not only the electric shock, it's the shock of the kind of being castrated. They cut the fact that it can be very violent. That is what a revolution is, isn't it? But it also is Prometheus. And who's Prometheus? Prometheus steals fire from the gods to give to humans because he loves humans so much. And then he pays by having his liver pecked out every night on the instructions of Zeus, right? And so it's the idea that there is something, and I've noticed this in charts, like you just have to look at some of the more innovative charts, like someone like James Joyce always comes to mind because it is such a heavily Aquarian type of chart and very progressive. They seem to be the rule breakers. If you have a very wired in Uranus, you're going to be the kind of person that isn't going to follow the rules. It's just hard. It's not like Saturn. I think Saturn is a rule follower, and Uranus, who comes after Saturn, definitely says, forget it. I am not following any rules. I am doing it my way. So I think, and I don't know if you've seen it, you're a consulting astrologer, so you've done a lot of charts, that there tends to be a bit of the radical around people that have highly wired in Uranuses. Would you agree with that?
Oh, totally. Yeah, totally. I mean, I've been looking at lately, just because I'm doing a study on harmonics, and I've looked a lot at Trump's chart because he's got a hyperactive Uranus, both from the elevation of it on his nodes next to his sun, opposite his moon, and wired into the fifth harmonic, which is a kind of very creative but very devilish, destructive harmonic. And it's remarkably similar to Hitler, who had the same pattern. And these are people who are extremely self-willed. They figured out a way to express their true will. And on the downside, it's an incredibly dangerous planet. But they definitely break the rules, do what... It's very Promethean in that sense on the downside. On the upside, it's very useful to leave behind all the restrictions. So, in other words, for example, the Catholic Church would not like Uranus, generally speaking. It's a Saturnian institution. Yeah. Uranus is very threatening because it's the idea that as you say, you have your own fire, so you don't need, someone to tell you what it is. You follow your own, you follow your own impulses. Isn't Uranus, though, to my understanding, isn't it in the mythology, isn't Uranus the king of the sky, or isn't it supposed to be that's the...
Yeah, he's originally, before the sun overtakes him, just like Jupiter does. He's one of the Titans, one of the original, king of that group. But that group is then in exile, right?
That makes so much sense to me, because to me it has that feeling of being your own guide, your own everything, which is the Uranian feeling. Again, I always understand planets and signs. They have a range, high and low end. Right. You can take any archetype and turn it into a very destructive force, or it can be a very positive force. On the positive side, that independence, maybe that's a good way to put it.
Yes,
independence is very Uranian. Yeah. It's why, think about it. Why do you get the American Revolution then? Because the Americans were looking for independence from Britain, but then it was the French moving in, and then back to that thing about democracy. And in that sense, I think democracy is Uranian, because it's both group think, group rule, and you're empowering individuals. You're saying to individuals, you have a vote, you have a say. I mean, in the US, it's extreme. You get to say anything you want, even if it's false. I mean, now we're grappling with that. But you can imagine, I mean, even in today's world, if you're in a less Uranian society, you can be jailed, you can be tortured sometimes for things that we think are nothing in America or Canada or, somewhere in Europe, right? So in that sense, Uranus associates to those things. But I still say that probably one of the most revealing connections is the electricity aspect of it. And in fact, it's a planet that feels electrical when it's in your...
Yes.
When you get an aspect, people will say, I can't sleep, I'm constantly wired. And I recall, a comedic episode way back when they had these astrologers on a TV program, and how they'll do something a little more, focus on the sensational. So they gave these astrologers all the same chart, to try to figure out what this person might be like, or what could be up with this person. And the chart had all kinds of Uranus aspects. And of course, these astrologers thought, okay, well, this is what I'm thinking they were thinking, I'm guessing.
Right.
This has to be someone who has a very, Uranian thing. So they all guessed this guy probably got hit by lightning. And it was someone that had been hit multiple times and escaped, because there were all these trines and sextiles. So the lightning would hit the person's hat and go right through their hat, and they wouldn't die. But that's classic, because Uranus rules lightning itself. It's the idea of the flash in the sky, like when you get a big epiphany, a big insight. Yes. That's Prometheus saying to you, hey, have you thought of doing this way instead of that way? Because then you would free yourself. Yeah.
It's interesting that you should say that, because there's good evidence that people do get hit more than once by lightning. And it's always something that's intriguing. Why? I mean, it's not that common. It's very uncommon, but it seems that there are people that get repeat hits, which is bizarre. And the fact that it could be aligned, and it makes sense to me as well that it's aligned with Uranus, because you're right. It is sudden hits and sudden changes and sudden, the unexpected. It comes from nowhere, and suddenly, you're forced to change direction, whether you like it or not. The other thing that's interesting about Uranus is that it's the first that really starts of the outer planets. This starts really aligning generationally, because it spends 7 years in a sign, right? It has an 84-year orbit. So unlike Saturn, which spends only 2.5 years, you can really start looking at generations according to where Uranus and the rest of the planets landed. So there is a kind of like the 60s. That's very Virgo. Uranus was in Virgo. Rachel Carson publishes, I'm trying to think of I'm sure somebody will be able to remember the book on the environment, and it will come to me. But there is a sudden interest in the environment, which is a very Virgo kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then it goes into Libra, and then we have, the emphasis on relationships in the 70s, people reevaluating how they see relationships. Then it goes into Scorpio, and then we suddenly have, an emphasis more, I guess it was before Pluto entered Scorpio, because that would have been probably in the I'm thinking Uranus was in Scorpio already in the late 70s. But in each place that it touches, you get a kind of a new group that you can identify. And it does really start marking out what people, so you could argue, well, wherever Uranus is for your generation, that's where you want to be world breakers. That's where you want to look at things differently. This is where perhaps you no longer accept the status quo. So you could say, well, today, let's just do at something recently. Uranus went into Taurus, 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago? How it's been there for a while. Yeah.
2018.
2018. It's been there even longer than I can remember. Okay. But you notice how one of the things that came up when Uranus went into Taurus is how many people started questioning the way the dollar, the position of the US dollar, and started talking about cryptocurrencies and, and blockchain, all these things that are Uranian, and Taurus, of course, being money. We no longer want to do business as usual. Whether that sticks or not is another thing. But it's interesting that it brings into highlight, into focus, the things you want to radically change. And so when it goes into Gemini, which will be, I guess, 26, 25, 26. Yeah. Okay. So then I think that what might be, because Gemini is about communication, I think that we are already seeing changes to the way we communicate in media. I think there might be a reckoning during the time that goes in there, because we're again revisiting Gemini kind of situations, right? So that's one thing to track, because I think this is what makes the outer planets very different from the traditional seven, right?
Yeah, I mean, the one scary thing about Uranus and Gemini is, first of all, it was discovered in Gemini.
Yes.
And that was a pretty tumultuous period.
Yeah.
But here's the upside. If you think of Uranus as being, in the end, first of all, it's in the human sign, the water bearer. There's a quality of the group, society at large, something is being freed and so forth. Then when it's there, if you look historically, it's not too easy. For example, in the 1860s, that was the American War, the American Civil War.
Civil War, yeah.
And then the next pass was the Second World War, two wars that were really brutal. And yet both of them led to much better conditions as a result. And we're going into another one of those periods. So in one sense, you'd say, I'd rather not go through there. But let's face it, there are some necessary changes. We're seeing this kind of thing happen now once again. I'm not 100% sure if it'll just be the clash between authoritarianism and democracy. Certainly that's there already. But whatever it is, it's meant to free the situation better on the other side. But you have to always go through the period. You can't avoid it. It's the way it is. Yeah.
And that speaks to how you really have to look at the chart in question to see, well, what does this really, because of course the American Sibley chart has Uranus or has Gemini in the seventh house. Yeah. And so you could argue that you have a reckoning with the other, whether the other is outside in the world, like in the World War II, or with the British, when it was discovered, or is it during the Civil War? Is the other, the people you're making the other inside your own country, which, by the way, I think pretty well defines what's going on there right now. Mm-hmm. And so, at some point you're going to have to dialogue with it, right? And that's a key word for Gemini, which is dialogue. So hopefully what it does produce in the end is a better way to dialogue about issues that are maybe difficult to dialogue about.
Right. The thing is, this is where my thinking on this is that the planet is the planet. It will do what it will do. Mm-hmm. And my feeling is Uranus seeks freedom. So good luck to you if you're trying to create restrictions, because that's not where it's going to go. It's going to go toward freedom whether you like it or not. And that's the bottom line, that planet, in a strange way, even though it's potentially the most selfish and crazy in some people's behavior, such as the couple that we mentioned before, nevertheless, to my mind, it advances humanity. And I actually think that is the entry into the age of Aquarius, so-called.
Okay,
the point when Uranus comes in. People are looking for the age of Aquarius through the constellations. Maybe, I can't be wrong about this because I'm not going to be here to argue about it. So if it's going to happen in 2600, great. Some new revolution comes in. But in terms of the behavior of Aquarius and Uranus, it's a total change. I mean, if you think about history, the demarcation line is the late 18th century. That's when things change completely.
Yes. For sure. I think that's something that's not understood by people who don't study history. Just I remember being an undergraduate historian, and that the one thing you were always taught, in fact, the title of the history books I had were the making of the modern world. Well, you began in the late 18th century, clearly, because, by the way, just something that is, very boring to most, but you look at the tracking demographically, what happened is a complete explosion of the population. That's the only way you could have had the kind of development you had in the 19th century, the exploitation, right? Because of that incredible. So yes, no, it's a misunderstanding what happened and how radical. It is so incredibly radical what happened down there at that point. And we kind of take it for granted now because we live in a world where change just happens, so you think, well, but you have to almost think of, and I was just speaking about this today with someone about how the romantic movement, which happens shortly after that, is a reaction to that change. People will always, because I'm predicting that there's going to be another romantic movement in art. And the reason is that the romantic movement creates a bunch of painters, poets, novelists, all sorts of artists who start going to nature and start to inhale nature and to deify nature and to worship nature and to, look for solace and consolation in the natural world. Why? Because the changes that were occurring mechanically were so difficult to understand that you always get in the artistic realm a reaction to that kind of thing. So you go into more dreamy, mystical kind of world, which of course then Neptune will solidify when it gets discovered. But it is a reaction. So I actually predict that even Saturn going into Pisces now was speaking to the fact that we're feeling so much change that the natural countervailing force will actually be art that produces something that just slows everybody down, says, okay, this is all changing. Let's go back to first principles, which of course always goes back to nature, to something that is slow, that is natural, that is not. Because the other thing we have to say is Uranus is associated very much with technology. So it's not a surprise to me if you're going to associate Uranus with Aquarius, the Pluto that just entered Aquarius. What's been in the talk of the town? It's been ChatGPT, AI. What's happening with AI? And every day there is a new AI program. Like I was listening today about in a writers group. Obviously, I'm a writer, so I pay attention to these things about how somebody was saying there's actually an AI program, can't remember the name, which can produce pretty quickly a schlocky romance novel if you want, or you give it the parameters on page 33, you do this, and then halfway through, and it knows because it's formulaic. And all writers and artists are very much up in arms. And my answer to that, being a writer, is, look, the only counter you can make to that is to write stuff that is more human based, that is a little bit more original. That's who's going to survive this game. If you're constantly producing things where you can game the system by, this is what schlock fiction is. You will do things according to, you see this on Netflix, by the way, a lot lately, that it's produced according to some sort of weird formula. I think that's easy to reproduce, but I still hold out that original creativity which transcends boundaries, are the radical people that refuse to give you what you want, that will break the rules, and that will produce something that's a lot more interesting. So I'm not as worried as a lot of people are, but I think this has come now into the foreground a lot. And it's because Pluto going through Aquarius over the next 20 years, the sign that is associated in the modern world with Uranus, I think the changes we're going to see are going to be absolutely monumental, just like the changes they saw in the 20 years between, the latter half of the 18th century were monumental. And it's not only political systems, it will be technology. I mean, it will be changes in the way, and we're already seeing it. I can't even imagine where we're heading with this. And so I think that's very confronting. And I'll go back to the original Uranus story. It feels like you're being castrated. It's too fast. It's not a slow merging like Neptune. It's not the ocean. You're not walking in slowly. This is like somebody just comes over and from one day to the next says, oh, hi, we found aliens. Here we are, right? I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, people, but please. But what I am saying is that it feels like an alien contact, right? That you don't know what to do with this kind of thing.
It's like a lightning bolt.
It is. It's a lightning bolt, yeah. And how you deal with it will depend on, well, first of all, I would say probably the way it's wired into your chart. If you're naturally very Uranian, I think you don't feel threatened by it. But if you're a very Saturn heavy person, in the sense that you worry about traditions, and then I see a lot of fear-based kind of thinking right now, which I think, first of all, you can't change things. That's the way it is. And that doesn't mean you don't address, because I think one of the things that's going to happen as Uranus moves into Gemini is what might be addressed are rules and regulations. Gemini also rules a lot with what you write down, right? So it may be that we start coming up with some regulations as to how this is how it should look, and this is how, but maybe it might also be the other, completely opposite, which is like just the Wild West. Go out and do whatever you want and see what happens. So I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation with this. And I think it is probably going to be a little bit unsettling because it is many years of feeling like you're being shocked, shock. Or like you say, having a lightning bolt hit you. But, there's an exciting part too. I think there's a lot of excitement with Uranus. If you look at massive change, it happens when it's there. So, it's not a bad thing altogether. It's just that maybe it happens at a pace which we're uncomfortable with. Maybe that's the thing that most challenges us, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true, because Uranus also rules speed, literally.
Right.
So, so it's rapid, and probably this is where you go back to Saturn, though, because any existing structure, unless you destroy the structure completely. And sometimes that's what can happen when Uranus cycles. You notice that, for instance, relationships can end very quickly or very suddenly, and then the structure isn't there anymore. But overall, when you talk about countries, systems, and so on, it's the health of the Saturn that is the trick. Even if the Uranus comes in with new ways of doing things, whatever it is, then it has to be incorporated into the structure. Right. And have it continue to operate properly. And but if you think about Uranus going back to its original sign and Uranus being strong at all in any period in history, I don't see how you can advocate all these rules that all of a sudden conservatives are freaking out because the world is changing too fast for them, and they don't like this. But it's pretty hard to sustain, the old order when the outer planets are strong like that. And if you put together Uranus returning to its own sign, and then the other planetoid Eris, which I think empowers. There's a tremendous gender empowerment going on. Right. That's going to destabilize things a whole lot, and you have to adapt and get with the program. Because if you don't get with the program, you're on the wrong side of not just history, but the wrong side of the way things are working, literally.
I think what may be happening, what we're seeing, is that there's the old story that a movement as it dies will scream the loudest. And I think what's happening is the conservative world we have is screaming really loudly right now because the pace of change that they already foresee happening is too much. And it has been too much for them. And they just have a moment in time where they're going to be nastier and more extreme and more limiting, basically because of fear. And this is something I think people should understand. If the conservative mentality, and I'm not just speaking about the United States, I'm speaking about Canada, I'm speaking about any country you look at, it is very fear-based. Everything that you fear is change is a big turnoff because you have no control over it. And it's based obviously on psychologically on the idea that you don't have control. And so the rest of us, will find a way to accommodate ourselves to that belief or to that realization. But I think when you're really, really fear-based, the thing you do is, instead of looking inside, which is what I think all evolved people do, and say, okay, this is coming from within. How can I deal with this in the psychological level so that I don't go around projecting it onto women, onto minorities, onto whatever group I've decided that are the enemy? Then the lack of awareness leads to a lot of conflict. And what you do is you become very repressive. You try to control everything around you so you can maintain power, right? And that is, I think, a very Saturnian and Plutonian thing, by the way. When we get to Pluto, we can revisit this notion. But I agree with you. I don't think Uranus allows you that. It says, yeah, forget that. I'm just going to come in with a big sickle and just, cut everything off. And it can be, and actually, if you look at anarchist movements, political movements that are really extreme, they have a Uranian feel. I always say that the Industrial Revolution really gets ugly in 1793 when the Committee of Public Safety starts deciding they're going to start eliminating all the enemies, right? And the enemies become bigger and bigger, and then it's their own inner circle they start eliminating. And that happens, right? That's just the extreme reaction. And so, these powers, you just have to learn how to balance them. But I guess because I'm so informed by Jung's work, Jung always said, look, the work has to begin with you. Forget the society. Just forget all that stuff. If you are not driven by fear, you are not going to behave like this. You're just not. So whenever I see a conservative screaming about women or whatever, I think, man, you're really full of fear. And if we could just sit you down and maybe psychoanalyze your bit and give you some tools so you wouldn't go around like that, then it would be better. But then you get a bunch of fearful people together, and then they start enacting laws and punishing anybody. Here's where I think that I see a big sea change, and I think I'm going to look at the generational shift that happened. One thing you look at is the combination of outer planet cycles meeting. And if you remember in the early 1990s, we had that incredible meeting of Uranus and Neptune, right? Mm-hmm. In Aquarius, was it Aquarius or Capricorn? I think it was Capricorn, right?
Capricorn.
Okay.
Capricorn.
So that whole group of people, including, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but other people that belong to that group, are coming into power. And I don't think that they're really interested in the status quo. I don't really think they're interested in doing things the way that it was done before. And even more, if you look at this group, this young group that my children belong to, that were born, the early 2000s, they're really not, they're a completely different group, completely. They just have no understanding. And so I have hope, because those groups are going to lead. It's not going to be the older group that are, right now what you see is disproportionate amount of power held by boomers who are very fear-ridden. And so I think there's hope in that group, this new group, was born with technology surrounding them. They don't know of a world where they didn't have these things. And I just don't think this is going to last. So these guys that are playing a game, it's the last gasp. I really think it's the last gasp. But I think the last gasp is always the most dangerous, because you're aware it's the last gasp, but you're going to fight extra hard. And this is my hope. And I think that if you just look at what's happened in the past, it probably makes the most sense that this is where it's heading. But that there will be a lot of dislocation and craziness first. Well, we've seen it. I think we've been in it for a long time. We just didn't notice until, the lunatics started showing up, that in fact, this had been a problem for a while. We just didn't want to own up to it, right?
Yeah, no, it's totally true. Because if you go back to the previous cycles in Gemini, it's pretty clear. It's been around for, I think it's three. The first return is the 1860s.
No.
And it was the US, but it was other things as well. There was a lot going on throughout the world. But notice, isn't it interesting that what was that fight about? It was about whether you should enslave human beings or not.
Yeah, that's it.
And the fight was, no, you can't do that, because they're human beings and they get to have a say, just like, oh, no, sorry, the planet doesn't argue with you, it just does it.
Yeah.
And then Second World War, same thing happened again. When you think about the Hitlerian thing, his idea was that there should only be this particular race. Everybody else is worthless. They should be removed. Well, the planet didn't agree. The planet said, sorry, not going to work out that way. So now we're in another Uranus cycle. But of course, with all the advancements that we've had in the last 84 years, since the planet was last there. And furthermore, too, when you think both it being in Gemini, because it's associated with an air sign, and it was discovered in an air sign, and air has that communication quality to it, such that where things are very different today than even in the last Uranus cycle, and certainly the one before that, is that information flies. So yes, there's more danger in the sense of things like AI, where you can fake things and so forth, and information moves very, very quickly. And I think a lot of times people are not given enough credit out there for being a lot more attuned than people say, oh, in the US, people don't know what's going on. That's not the sense I'm getting. You can often tune into polls and people get it. They get what's going on, and it may take them a little longer, but they start to act in their, self-interest and in the interest of the group, rather than the insanity that we've seen at times.
Well, you just pointed out a really interesting thing, by the way, which is, of course, if you do go back to the Civil War, it was a group of people trying to dominate and enslave another group, and had been, and then that was enough. It was no longer going to be accepted, although you could argue that it continued underground in some ways, but the fact is that was a big break. And of course, the Second World War, with the otherizing of Hitler, became ridiculous, and extreme and plutonic in the darkest of ways. But actually what you've seen, especially in the United States, but we see it in Canada here too, by the way. Nobody's exempt from this. And you see it in Hungary with Orban. You see it in the UK with their reaction to immigrants coming in, the way they're behaving. It's horrible. Is the idea that, somehow white people are the only people that should be in power, should have rights. And then the way you do it is they start playing the victim game of, We have no rights. It's illogical. It's insane. But again, it's the people who are not willing to accept the world has changed. And I think if you are Uranian, you accept the world changes, and it's okay. And there will be, there will be some things that don't function the way you want them to, but you accept the concept of change. But I think this is what's really heading. And I think, honestly, this is also associated with levels of education. You see it constantly. It's a lot easier to manipulate people when they are educated to believe all sorts of nonsense and they're not. So really, Gemini is also teachers, right? And to me, my biggest hope for Uranus going through Gemini is that there is a reform of the education system so that at least you get information that is vetted, that you teach people media literacy so they know that, they go on Fox, they're getting complete inventions and you should avoid that. And you just, one great word for Uranus too, for me, is the act of castration is also an extreme form of discernment, right? The masculine function, I do associate Uranus with a masculine or yang kind of vibe, is one where you discern with a sword what is actually fact and what is made up. And this is really important. We need to know these things. And so my hope when it goes into Gemini is that it also empowers the educational system to say, you know what, we got to look at this again. We can't have homeschooling to a crazy event where people are teaching people, their kids, things that are actually making them less able. I'm not just picking on homeschooling because there's some pretty good reasons to homeschool, but you know what I mean, that you have little enclaves of people saying, we're going to sit here and make the other the enemy. You can't work as a society if you're not coming up with principles that you all adhere to. So I'm hoping that that's the other thing that might actually be addressed. This idea that communication does actually have to be looked at, and there is fact and there is fiction. And I think as Neptune, and we'll talk about Neptune the next time, as it went through Pisces, it really muddied the waters big time, right? It really became, so I'm hoping also as it moves into Aries that you get more discernment, because Aries, of course, is ruled by Mars, and Mars is the planet of discernment. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting times, that curse. May you live in interesting times. I think we're living in interesting times, but a lot of radical change for sure. And a lot of feeling of instability, which is the other thing I think Uranus brings by transit, or just if you have it wired in. You always think that you're always kind of ready to be hit again because things are not quite grounded. It's not as like Saturn to me is a grounded planet, for example, right? Yeah. And its rulership, especially of Capricorn, you feel like you're touching the earth. Uranus is a sky god. He's like totally up there, right? Totally in a place you can't even relate to. And so I think that's another reason that it terrifies the people, because you have nothing to hang on to. It's like, okay, I hope to God it comes in and it doesn't, hit me with an electric shock and kill me. So it's a fascinating, but again, yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that in the U.S. chart has this really strong Uranus by virtue of it crossing the angle minutes before the birth of the country, and we know that it is a strong planet for all kinds of reasons and the way the countries evolved and so forth. But the U.S. has a very strong Saturn too. Saturn squares the Sun. You cannot shake those institutions and that foundation easily. It is going to fight back. It's well organized, and it will always form around something, tangible and solid. It's hard to shake, and I think that's why, despite all the recriminations, people are saying, "Oh, these people get away with everything." I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing, slow and steady, but including what just happened. This hadn't happened ever, really. This defamation thing with Fox.
Yeah. Which again is information.
Yeah, and they're not done. I don't think that's done. I think
it's not done. No. But again, on a larger archetypal way, it is a paying the piper moment, right? And I think that might be associated also with Pluto moving into Aquarius, which also, if you think about it, what was decided? Something about a technology company at the end of the day, because that company is associated with an Aquarian thing. They're tabulating votes using technology. And again, it's very easy to make people suspicious, and that's what they were able to do by just bringing the word technology in, because people have a natural fear of things they don't understand mechanically, right? Or they don't understand how it works.
But to be fair, that whole thing was such a canard, because Dominion and Smartmatic were producing paper trails.
Of course.
I mean, you have to really get. It was an Italian satellite,
Yeah, of course. But again, this is, we go back to Uranus going through Gemini and the hope and the possibility for perhaps better information training, I think that's got to happen. And so that may be one of the outcomes. But will it be easy? No, I mean, you can't ever predict these things. But by looking at history, you know that those are tough times. But you said it, I think we'll end with this because you started with this. They're also necessary because some things don't work.
They're necessary, and most importantly, they bring a better situation as a result. That's the bottom line. That's what you have to focus on.
Right. I think like any outer planet transit, and we'll talk about Neptune, which I think is one that is really not talked about enough next time, and Pluto, I think that one thing people should understand that it's not a picnic while you're going through it, but I think a lot of people, once they're through it and have some distance, often say, thank God that happened. Thank God that marriage ended suddenly. Thank God that job, I got kicked out of that job. At the moment, you feel in turmoil and you feel completely unmoored, but looking ahead and then being with the benefit of hindsight, you go, oh my God, that's why it happened for me, not to me, but for me, right? That's the key to this whole thing. Okay, well, next time we'll meet up with I think the one planet that I think is ignored the most, which is funny because Neptune, of course, has a signification of being kind of watery and lost. And I think people don't pay enough attention to that one. It's one of the ones that seems to be ignored. So let's talk about that one. Okay?
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Until next time.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to hear more about all of this, go to YouTube where you will find Andre's channel called Astrology Alert. He posts videos there almost daily. He also teaches classes through his Patreon account. You can find me at sophiacycles.com. If you want to support my work, I've recently released a new novel called Invocation, which you may find of interest. Go to my website to see a book trailer about it. It's available in all fine bookstores, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Finally, if you like this podcast, please rate it and leave a review so that others will find it as well.